Grandpa, tell me again about how you used to come here and play when you were a boy.
Well, when I was a boy, it seemed like there was no end to summer and no end to Point Defiance Park. The trails stretched for miles. There was the old zoo and the aquarium. You could rent horses to ride or go on rides in the amusement park. See over there? That's where the pool used to be. And over there is where we used to play baseball or tag or just run around and mess around.
For generations of Tacomans, Point Defiance Park has sparkled as the crown jewel of our city's public spaces and provided memories to last a lifetime. In the 100 years since its formal inception as a park, Point Defiance has served as an urban oasis, a forested refuge, and a place of gathering for occasions both leisurely and momentous. It is a significant heritage of beauty, natural history, and stewardship that we have inherited from past generations and will bequeath to those of the future.
Probably no other city in this country has such a beautiful natural park. Its setting and relation to the city are unique and ideal. Every citizen of Tacoma should feel it a duty and a privilege to become one of the guardians.
Bordered on three sides by the tidal waters of Puget Sound, the unique shape of Point Defiance was carved over tens of thousands of years by the repeated advances and retreats of massive glaciers over the Puget Sound lowlands. Between these periods of glacial coverage, countless streams laid down deposits of clays, sands, gravels, and boulders that gave us the curious layering seen in the cliffs around Point Defiance. Centuries of wave action and earthquakes further shaped the landscape, as cliffs and landslides collapsed to form many of the beaches we see today. Over time, Point Defiance developed a forest with large stands of hemlock, fir, and cedar. Native species of alder, maple, and madrona also flourished in many areas. Today, extensive stands of old-growth forest remain, some of the last in the Puget Sound area. Elk, black bear, and cougar once dwelled in the park, and despite the encroachment of human settlement, wild animals still range over the peninsula. These include deer, mink, raccoon, and many bird species such as woodpeckers and bald eagles. To the southern Puget Sound Salish, the native peoples who historically inhabited this area, the peninsula was called Sichitos, meaning near face or near cliff. For untold generations, tribal people of the Nisqually and Puyallup often used these beaches for campsites when traveling by canoe in Puget Sound. And while there was an abundance of wildlife, berries, and beaches for clam digging along the eastern shore, there is no historical evidence to suggest there was ever a permanent settlement here.
The banks rise nearly perpendicular and are composed of sandstone. A great variety of shrubs grow along their base. This narrow pass seems as if intended by nature to afford every means for the defense of Puget Sound. Point Defiance, on the east, commands all of the approaches to it. The Narrows, if strongly fortified, would bid defiance to any attack and guard its entrance against any force.
The name Point Defiance came into use toward the middle of the 19th century, courtesy of U.S. Navy Lieutenant Charles Wilkes, in recognition of the defiance that the commanding views of the Narrows, Commencement Bay, and Admiralty Inlet would offer to any attack. The Wilkes expedition of 1838 to 1842 was principally a scientific voyage of inquiry, but the expedition also mapped and named many features of the Northwest that would eventually become a part of the United States. 49 years before Wilkes, Captain Vancouver had sailed these very waters, but there are no indications his expedition ever set foot on the shores of Point Defiance or offered it a name. When the United States established the Washington Territory in 1853, the military became keenly interested in fortifying and protecting these new lands. In 1860, soldiers stationed at Fort Steilacoom, a U.S. Army outpost, made reconnaissance surveys to Point Defiance to evaluate it as a source of fresh water as well as a potential site for fortification. Just a few short years later, in 1866, soon after Job Carr built his home along the shores of Commencement Bay, President Andrew Johnson set aside 640 acres of Point Defiance as a federal government military reservation. As the new settlement of Tacoma grew and prospered through the 1870s and into the 1880s, the Point Defiance acreage was off limits to development due to its federal status. Lack of roads and land transportation precluded much local interest in the heavily wooded peninsula. Other than adventurers arriving by water to camp on its beaches, or the occasional opportunist cutting firewood, Point Defiance drew little attention from area residents. Bolstered by its designation as the terminus of the Northern Pacific Railroad and the steady influx of people seeking new lives in the West, Tacoma began to inch closer to this area and changed its perspective on the possibilities it could offer to the people of the city. The history of Point Defiance as a park actually began in 1888. As the early real estate developers of Tacoma's western edge planned for a streetcar line to link their new neighborhoods to downtown Tacoma, they quickly recognized that having a prominent park at the edge of new residential development would attract people to move into the area. A streetcar going all the way out to a park at the Point might even be a destination in its own right for the people living a few miles away in the city. Tacoma's movers and shakers of the day, notably Isaac W. Anderson, Alan C. Mason, and Hugh Wallace, spearheaded the move to petition the U.S. Congress to let the city of Tacoma use the undeveloped military reservation as a park. Make no mistake, all these men had financial interests in housing developments and streetcar lines, but conflict of interest was not an impediment to getting things done in the Tacoma of the 1880s. A major problem was that Washington was still a territory, not yet a state, and it didn't have a senator of its own to represent local interests in Washington, D.C. Wheels had to be greased and palms crossed to make things happen. Mason put up $500 of his own money, and Wallace went off to Washington, D.C. to enlist the aid of the territory's representative to the House of Representatives. In 1888, legislation allowing Tacoma to use Point Defiance as a park passed through Congress, but President Grover Cleveland promptly vetoed it. After a reserve clause was added, guaranteeing the federal government could reclaim the land in case of necessity, the measure passed again through Congress, and President Cleveland signed it on December 17, 1888. Tacoma had its park, but in name only. Before Point Defiance Park could be developed, the streetcar line had to be completed. Mason delivered, sometimes advancing his own money for construction, and personally drove the final spike on the Point Defiance line in early 1890. That same year, newly elected Mayor Stuart Rice, who also happened to be a partner of Mason's in the streetcar line, appointed a board of park commissioners to administer the fledgling park system, which initially consisted of Wright Park, Ferry Park, and Point Defiance. Among the new park board members were those Tacoma movers and shakers, Alan C. Mason and Isaac W. Anderson. Establishing parks in urban areas was very much in keeping with an American trend in the second half of the 19th century. Early landscape architects believed that harmonious landscapes and public spaces, open to all people, would serve as an antidote to increasing urbanization of post-Civil War America. Parks were to be graceful, democratic, pastoral, and rejuvenating, separate from the intrusions of daily life, and sheltered as much as possible from conflicting uses. This seems pretty standard to us now, but it was a fairly dramatic concept back then. By setting aside large tracts of land and planning to improve them for public use, Tacoma was at the forefront of this movement.
One of the summer pleasures was camping at Point Defiance. to which Tacomans went to spend several days or weeks at a time, and they were careful to take arms. An Indian shot a large cougar there in 1884, and bears and bobcats frequently were seen.
Developing Point Defiance into a park required clearing large amounts of fallen timber and underbrush. The park board immediately authorized a subscription to raise funds for this purpose, and Tacoma citizens contributed $3,600. Landscape architect Edward O. Schwargel, who had been involved in the early planning of Wright Park, surveyed Point Defiance and produced a detailed topographical map that was the basis for park planning throughout the 1890s. In summer 1890, Ebenezer R. Roberts was hired to oversee clearing the park and carrying out Schwargel's vision. Roberts was a noted Welsh landscape gardener who had worked in Britain at several large and well-known estates and was ultimately appointed as Tacoma's first superintendent of parks. Roberts and his workers also faced clearing out a number of people who were informally occupying land in Point Defiance. While park board minutes of the 1890s referred to them as squatters, there was a long-standing tradition of people building temporary summer huts or creating campsites for extended stays at Point Defiance. Early park board attempts to remove squatters from the park were unsuccessful. In 1896, the board bowed to reality and decided instead to charge $3 per lot for the season, perhaps in an effort to distinguish seasonal holiday campers from true illegal habitation on public property. However, squatters were not the only problem people in the park. Board meeting minutes document a scandalous incident when 2 women and 1 man were seen bathing in a nude condition on the beach. A special meeting was called and a resolution passed that these nude bathers must be identified and prosecuted to the full extent of the law. There is no record that the wrongdoers were ever apprehended or prosecuted. The sloping lawn at the entrance area, informally referred to as the bowl, was the first part of the park to be developed. The area formed a natural drainage bowl, or, as one newspaper article of the day termed it, a great cedar swamp, waist deep and covering 2.5 acres during the rainy season. By 1898, excavation for a formal pond with fountains was underway. Once cleared, the adjacent lowland was initially used as a bulb farm, producing award-winning hyacinths. But soon, it was incorporated into a pen for bison as a part of early zoological gardens in the park. Another of the earliest known improvements in Point Defiance Park was construction of a log bridge. Made up of some 3,500 logs, the bridge was approximately 250 feet long and 80 feet high. Known as the Rustic Bridge, it acted as the gateway from the developed areas near the entrance of the park to the wild forested areas out toward the point. The bridge spanned a gulch and a stream which was later dammed, creating a pond featuring a series of smaller, picturesque rustic bridges. Other additions in the 1890s included a waiting area for the streetcar line, a fruit stand, and a wharf, which was later enlarged into a restaurant and boathouse. By 1899, Tacoma's pride in its new park shined brightly. That year, the Tacoma Sunday Ledger hailed Point Defiance Park as Tacoma's great showplace and detailed how the park had grown over the decade. Near the beach, bathing huts were available for visitors to change into bathing suits. Animals were also a feature of the park, with enclosures for elk and deer, a monkey, exotic birds, and a solitary black bear. Most of these early structures have been replaced, and little of the early flavor of the park remains, with one notable exception. In 1898, the Park Board recognized that on-site housing for Superintendent Roberts would enhance security and help stop people taking timber from the park. The board approved $2,220 to build Roberts a residence within the park. It's known today as the Lodge. This house was designed by noted Tacoma architect C.A. Darmer. Newspaper descriptions of the house referred to it as an ideal rural home built of polished peeled logs with an immense colonial veranda running around the entire house.
The beautiful maple paneling of the front parlor and the library formed a distinctive background for the fine furnishings and rare pieces of bric-a-brac, so beloved as home decoration in those days. The decor of the dining room was a combination of handsome wallpaper and panels of royal blue burlap. A grooved, polished plate rail held a collection of hand-painted souvenir plates from every state then in the Union.
Point Defiance Lodge served as the residence of park superintendents and Metropolitan Park District executive directors and their families until 1980. Today, this historic home is maintained as a rental facility for meetings, parties, and weddings, and treasured for the gracious beauty it lends to the formal gardens. Point Defiance's Rose Garden, situated in the same place since 1895, began with rose cutting donations that Superintendent Roberts solicited from school children. The appeal proved successful. Just 3 years later, 75 varieties of roses were flourishing in the park, and 500-foot arbors covered walkways throughout the gardens. At the turn of the 20th century, some in the community were already looking to preserve Tacoma's early history. Clinton P. Ferry, the Tacoma businessman who donated the first park to Tacoma, recognized the importance of the Job Carr cabin. Ferry and the Board of Park Commissioners spearheaded a drive to move the Job Carr cabin from its original Old Town location to Point Defiance Park. In 1900, the cabin was moved to a site near the present tennis courts on the bluff above the Vashon Ferry landing. In 1917, the cabin was moved again to the entrance of 5 Mile Drive. In 1901, the first greenhouse was added to Point Defiance Park. Constructed at a cost of over $2,000, the structure was 100 feet long and 25 feet wide. Initially both a production greenhouse for plant propagation as well as a display greenhouse for exotic plants and palms, by 1906 these two functions were already at odds with each other, as growing crowds of visitors competed with the space needed for a working greenhouse. The problem was solved when E.R. Roberts encouraged his good friend W.W. Seymour to donate $10,000 to build the conservatory at Wright Park. Even though additional wings were added to the greenhouse, by the 1920s, plant production and care were relocated to the southeast corner of the park and the building dismantled. To entertain the large numbers of people coming to enjoy Point Defiance Park in 1901, a concert garden with a shell bandstand was built near where the pagoda now stands. On Sundays, people would flock to the park for band concerts during the summer months, take in a picnic, and let children play on 6 new swings constructed nearby. Clearly, the park was becoming a place that offered visitors a variety of activities and experiences. In keeping with that approach, Edwin D. Ferris was awarded a contract to run a restaurant and boathouse. Initially, he may have used the existing fruit stand and wharf, but by the end of 1902, Ferris had an agreement to build a restaurant and pavilion at his own expense. Ferris built an octagonal structure 60 feet in diameter with a covered porch extending out an additional 16 feet. The pavilion contained a restaurant and stands for soft drinks and refreshments such as ice cream and peanuts. The pavilion's upper floor was reserved as a residence for Mr. and Mrs. Ferris, with the third-story cupola intended as an observatory. This new pavilion became a major draw to Point Defiance Park. The restaurant was known for expansive views of Puget Sound and for the house specialty, Mrs. Ferris's clam chowder. By 1903, the crowds were so great that the streetcar company added an additional track on the Point Defiance line. In 1906, Superintendent Roberts designed and built a giant log arch to welcome visitors arriving through the Pearl Street entrance. A newspaper article of the day heralded the arch as likely to become as famed as the rustic bridge. This impressive entrance arch shows up in a number of early views of the park. However, it was short-lived and gone by 1911. By 1903, there was a growing feeling that actual title to the land that comprised Point Defiance Park should be granted to the city of Tacoma. In May of that year, President Theodore Roosevelt planned a visit to Tacoma. The excitement over a presidential stopover was palpable among city residents. E.R. Roberts and his staff even constructed a chair made of antlers from the Point Defiance elk herd to present as a gift from the park board. But Bernice Newell, a local newspaper reporter, known more for the society pages and arts organizations than anything else, had different plans. She supported the call for Tacoma to own Point Defiance outright, and she rose to the occasion with a spirit that may have shocked her regular society page readers. In her column, Mrs. Newell proposed to kidnap President Roosevelt and spirit him away on the streetcar to Point Defiance. Once there, she described in rich detail the wonders that could be seen in the park. Her article ended with an impassioned plea.
Mr. President, don't you think it would be only fair if Uncle Sam would fix it so Tacoma could have Point Defiance Park for her very own and never have to think of the possibility of its being taken away from her? It is all the resort the great army of busy people have, and if Uncle Sam could see how they use it, he would never rest until he had provided that it could never be taken away. Don't you think so?
Bernice Newell was hardly alone. Others more influential than she also saw the need for Tacoma to obtain full title to Point Defiance. Francis W. Cushman, a member of the House of Representatives for the District of Tacoma, wielded a great deal of power and influence in Washington, D.C. Cushman put forth House Resolution 17019 to obtain title to Point Defiance Park for the city of Tacoma, which he pushed to a successful vote of the full Congress. On March 3, 1905, President Roosevelt signed the legislation giving Tacoma Point Defiance Park. Following acquisition of such an important piece of civic real estate, Stuart Rice, now serving as president of the Park Board, realized the need for a separate base of tax support exclusively for parks. As a result of his efforts, the Metropolitan Park District was created in 1907 as an entity separate from the city of Tacoma.
The view to the northwest from the point toward the great Olympic Range, with the snow-capped peaks glistening in the sunshine, has been pronounced by those who know to be equal to views in Italy and the Mediterranean.
Creating the Metropolitan Park District had immediate ramifications for Point Defiance Park. For nearly 20 years, since Tacoma first had permission to develop the property as a park, Point Defiance had been progressing in fits and starts, not guided by any particular plan. While Superintendent Roberts had accomplished a great deal, he was really more of a hands-on gardener, builder, planter, and occasional animal keeper than a professional park planner. When Roberts departed in 1908, the board decided to seek professional advice to plan the park's future development. In 1910, the board engaged the services of the prominent Kansas City landscape architectural firm Hare & Hare to study topographical maps of the park, survey and photograph the terrain, and, according to the Tacoma Ledger, prepare complete plans and specifications for the full development of the park in such manner that they may be intelligently carried out at some future time. Hare & Hare was comprised of Sidney J. Hare and his son, S. Herbert Hare. It is believed that Sidney did most of the survey work at Point Defiance, spending 2 weeks in March 1911 hiking around the park, taking measurements and photographs. The resulting Hare & Hare plan, as it came to be known, was delivered to the Board of Park Commissioners in July of that year. The plan looked at Point Defiance Park in zones, or what the designers termed function and natural divisions. An athletic field, playground, swimming pool, and service area were outlined for the area that is now covered by the road to the Vashon Ferry Landing and the land to the east. Additional recommendations suggested an entrance, zoo, conservatory, superintendent's house, gardens, streetcar station, and music court, all to be located in the area we think of today as the bowl with the formal gardens. While some of these features, such as the lodge and the gardens, already existed, others were never implemented. One that was is the pagoda. Exotic and luxurious, it was built in 1914 as a streetcar station in the Japanese pagoda style. The women's restroom was furnished with easy chairs, couches, and in the summer an attendant to hand out towels and keep the facility clean. Men visiting the pagoda found a separate smoking room and marble lavatories. The waiting room itself was roomy with tile floors and walls, comfortable chairs, and a fireplace to keep warm in cool weather. In 1963, efforts began to give the gardens around the pagoda a more characteristic Japanese feel. In the 1980s, a Shinto shrine and torii gate were installed east of the pagoda. Both had been gifts to the city of Tacoma from its sister city, Kirikaiushu, Japan. Also located in the Japanese garden is an artillery shell from the battleship USS Maine. In November 1898, the Park Board petitioned the U.S. Secretary of War for a relic from the Maine, which had been sunk in Havana Harbor earlier that year. In 1912, a shell donated by veterans of the Spanish-American War was installed alongside the well-traveled path that linked the streetcar terminal with the boathouse pavilion and can still be seen today. At the time of Sidney Hare's visit in 1911, the beach area featured the octagonal boathouse and a dirt path leading west. It was the Hare and Hare report that recommended constructing a concrete promenade and enlarging the boathouse pavilion to handle greater public use. The main picnic areas, with surrounding walks and vistas, are still located in the same area they were 90 years ago. In addition, the Hare and Hare plan recommended building more picnic areas out along what is now 5 Mile Drive. Finally, and perhaps most importantly for the future protection of Point Defiance as a significant piece of public property, the plan recognized and underlined the dire need for larger water lines running to and throughout Point Defiance to combat the very real threat of forest fire. While the plan was not without controversy, and many of the proposals were never followed, the spirit of the Hare and Hare Plan of 1911 guided Point Defiance Park's development through the 1930s, and many features advocated by the plan are still in evidence today. By the very nature of its geography, the waterfront has played a significant role in Point Defiance Park's development and has possibly seen more change than any other part of the park. Swimming has been a popular activity at Point Defiance since the first bathers braved the chilly waters of Puget Sound. On Memorial Day 1906, the chill was taken out of the water when Tacoma's first indoor swimming pool opened, the Neredes Baths. A saltwater natatorium, or swimming pool, the Neredes Baths got its name from the sea goddesses who rendered assistance to sailors in Greek mythology. For 25 cents admission, swimmers enjoyed a 50 by 150-foot pool filled with water pumped up from Puget Sound and heated to 80 degrees. It featured a diving board, spectators gallery, dressing rooms, even rented bathing suits. Old-timers recall how the cotton-knit bathing suits stretched unflatteringly out of shape when wet. For more than 20 years, Tacomans swam and frolicked in the Neredes Baths. But the combination of an aging wooden building exposed to humid saltwater and changes in health regulations numbered the bath's days. By the late 1920s, other options were being considered for the structure, including refurbishing it as an ice rink or a gymnasium. But following the 1929 stock market crash and the onset of the Depression, there was little money to invest in renovation, and the loss of discretionary income from many of Tacoma's citizens translated into declining attendance. Finally, the Neredes Baths was forced to close and was demolished in 1932.
Did you ever go swimming there, Grandpa?
No, but my father did. He loved to swim. I remember my grandmother telling me about how she always had to stop him from splashing the other kids. But I played a lot of baseball in the park, and rides. I remember going on rides screaming at the top of my lungs.
Nearby was Wallace Playfield, named for Hugh C. Wallace, a distinguished Tacoma citizen and a former ambassador to France who had been instrumental in creating the park. Wallace Playfield consisted of a baseball diamond where many youth played ball. The realities of the 1929 stock market crash saw that the field never developed into a major athletic venue, with playfields, children's wading pool, tennis courts, an archery course, and locker rooms, as called for in the Hare and Hare report. Today, the site is used for parking. As the Great Depression deepened in the 1930s, the need for family entertainment drew the attention of private developers, who invested $100,000 to construct Funland, Tacoma's first amusement park. Attractions included the Dodgem, Merry Mix-Up, Buzzer, tilt-a-whirl, water scooter, miniature train, red bug, shooting gallery, skee ball, and penny arcade. Only legitimate and wholesome amusements would be offered, according to a newspaper article, when it opened in 1933. In fact, concern was so great that Funland not become a tawdry amusement park with games of chance that the park board commissioners personally inspected Funland and tested the rides prior to the opening to ensure that the public was protected. Through the Depression, World War II, and into the 1960s, Funland brought joy to many park visitors. But changing attitudes in the 1970s, with an emphasis on the environment instead of entertainment within parks, halted plans to revitalize Funland. Today, the only vestiges of this area as an amusement zone are the go-kart track and batting cages. Many Tacoma residents may also recall an old railway steam locomotive that sat proudly in an area immediately south of Funland between 1954 and 1973. Engine 1364 was built for the Northern Pacific Railroad in 1902. It is currently under restoration in Toppenish by the Yakima Valley Rail and Steam Association. Looking to the east from the ferry landing is the Tacoma Yacht Club, which has had a home on Point Defiance's waterfront since 1914 and has been housed in the present clubhouse since 1971. The ferry landing was established in its current location in 1918. Early ferries were passenger-only boats, part of the Mosquito fleet that tied up at the dock near the original pavilion. These boats connected Point Defiance with downtown Tacoma, Gig Harbor, Browns Point, and various points on Vashon Island and the Kitsap Peninsula. As activity along the shoreline increased, the demand for boat rentals, fishing, food concessions, and ferry service required more space than the existing octagonal boathouse could provide. In 1919, construction began on a new boathouse pavilion designed by noted Tacoma architect Ambrose J. Russell. To be completed in 2 stages, this second pavilion was to be part of a much larger complex with a central tower and 2 long wings projecting from it. Only the northwest wing was ever built. It was a massive concrete building 90 by 170 feet that featured restaurants, a ballroom, and esplanade. In 1921, the ground story was dedicated, and in 1925, the second and third levels were completed. In 1933, a trial aquarium, consisting of 1 tank, was installed and generated enough interest that 3 years later, the ground floor of the pavilion was converted for use as a new aquarium. This larger aquarium grew to 20 tanks and more than 100 specimens, including Oscar the octopus and Dub-Dub, a hair seal pup who arrived in 1938. Donated by a local oyster farmer, Dub-Dub supposedly received his moniker when a small child viewed him and cheerfully exclaimed, "Dub-Dub!" Dub-Dub entertained visitors for decades and astounded zoo staff by living to the ripe old age of 33, more than twice the usual life expectancy. The second floor of this pavilion was initially used as a restaurant, but became the home of U.S. Army Air Corps crash boat crews during World War II. These men were responsible for rescuing downed flight crews in the event of a loss of military aircraft over Puget Sound. Many a Tacoma girl remembers these dashing young men at Point Defiance during the war years. The third floor of the new pavilion was used for staff housing. Boathouse manager Arthur Aiken lived here in the 1930s, and zookeeper Oscar Olson called it home in the 1940s. Fires eventually destroyed the upper floors, but the lower level is still used for boat storage today. Once again, increasing popularity of Point Defiance Park necessitated a new building. The boathouse was completed in 1940 by the Works Progress Administration, a federal government work relief program which was actively working in many parts of the park. The largest municipally owned boathouse in the United States, it was a favorite spot for fishermen, water carnivals, fishing derbies, and many other activities. But fire took its toll once again. In September 1984, the Point Defiance Boathouse, along with 250 privately owned boats, was destroyed by a 3-alarm arson fire. In spring 1988, the present Point Defiance Boathouse opened and has once again become a second home to Point Defiance fishermen. A new restaurant, added in 1990 and built in an octagonal shape to suggest the original 1903 pavilion, brings back the tradition of dining at Point Defiance.
Is that the new restaurant where we celebrated Grandma's birthday? That was fun. She was really surprised.
Yes, she was. That was quite a family outing, wasn't it? Walking down the promenade after dinner reminded me of when we used to have picnics at New Beach.
New Beach?
Just as today, people in 1916 enjoyed strolling the shoreline toward Owen Beach. To make it accessible during high tide, construction began on a seawall and promenade that would eventually reach 3,000 feet in length and finally connect the boathouse to the beach. Approximately halfway along the promenade is a vantage point from which to look up into the ravine that was once topped by the old rustic bridge. Now called the Sound Garden, this is an area where the changing environmental sounds of water, wind, and trees whisper to the listener. At the end of this long promenade lies Owen Beach, referred to in earlier days by seasonal campers and picnickers as New Beach, or sometimes Picnic Beach. It was named in 1959 to honor Floyd Owen, a 47-year Metropolitan Park District employee who served many of those years as the superintendent of parks. For generations, Native American salmon bakes have been a local tradition. It is believed that modern salmon bakes were held on Owen Beach as early as the 1920s. When Seattle played host to the 1962 World's Fair, the Park District and the Tacoma Chamber of Commerce partnered to sponsor a weekly salmon bake to draw fairgoers to Tacoma. These bakes proved so popular to locals that for 20 years they were held several times each summer and frequently featured fireworks and the Seattle Seafair Pirates.
Point Defiance Park is becoming the home of a rare zoological exhibit.
In the first years of Point Defiance Park, the area of open land, greenhouses, and gardens near the park's main Pearl Street entrance was closely linked with what visitors now know as the Point Defiance Zoo and Aquarium. The early buffalo and elk pens were a far cry from today's animal sanctuary and conservation center that covers nearly 30 acres on the hill above the formal gardens. Back when Park Superintendent Roberts served as head animal keeper, many of the animals that found their way to the Point Defiance Park Zoo were brought to Tacoma by sailors, who collected specimens from the distant and exotic ports they visited. Some of the first celebrity residents of the zoo arrived in 1913. Dave and Dandy, the faithful oxen who pulled Ezra Meeker's wagon in his return to the Oregon Trail, came to live out their days with the elk and buffalo herds. Following their deaths in 1915, the oxen were preserved by taxidermists and placed in the Washington State Historical Society Museum, where generations of Tacoma school children visited them on field trips. The 1930s and 40s saw little physical expansion of the zoo, as the park board coped with the budgetary challenges of the Great Depression and the financial sacrifices of the home front during World War II. By 1949, the zoo's buildings were showing their age, and when a local newspaper article chronicled the particularly dilapidated and hazardous conditions of a circa 1913 animal house, the park board voted to demolish the structure within hours of the story's publication. That year, Tacoma residents began to rally support for the zoo, which culminated in the founding of the Tacoma Zoological Society. By 1959, penny drives, membership sales, and other donations allowed the addition of several new exhibits and a children's farm zoo, to the delight of visiting families. The 1960s saw further developments on the grounds. In 1963, the aquarium and Dub Dub moved from the Waterfront Pavilion Boathouse up the hill into a new, round, state-of-the-art building. For the first time, the park's land and marine animal collections were united in one location that could truly be called Point Defiance Zoo and Aquarium. In 1965, one of the zoo's most famous animals ever arrived. Cindy the Asian elephant was just under 3 years old and weighed 3,000 pounds. At the time, there was no money to build a permanent home for Cindy, so the Tacoma Rotary Club began a fund drive to raise $10,000 for an elephant house. Tacoma's love affair with Cindy would last almost 40 years. A noteworthy addition in 1969 was the arrival of 2 red wolves that would play an important role in efforts to save this critically endangered species. Zoo staff worked closely with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service on a captive breeding project that continues to the present. Eventually, the successful reintroduction of red wolves into the wild would earn the zoo the American Zoo and Aquarium Association's highest conservation honor, the Edward H. Bean Award. By the mid-1970s, the zoo's only polar bear was housed in the crumbling bear pit built in 1899. The Kodiak and grizzly bears had to be moved to other zoos after their cages literally fell apart, and the barn built to hold the adolescent elephant Cindy had become too small for her ever-growing size. It was clear that something had to be done. With estimates for improving the zoo reaching into the millions of dollars, it was no longer an option to obtain the money through private funds. In November 1977, voters overwhelmingly approved the first of several bond measures that brought outstanding new exhibits to zoo visitors. The zoo adopted a Pacific Rim theme, focusing on land and marine animals from countries adjacent to the Pacific Ocean. Gone were the iron bars and cages of old, and in came free-roaming, spacious exhibits, as seen in the award-winning Polar Bear Complex, Rocky Shores area featuring walruses E.T. and Rosie, and the Discovery Reef Aquarium. The latest addition to the zoo is the lush new Asian Forest Sanctuary, which opened in July 2004, featuring Sumatran tigers, Malayan tapir, white-cheeked gibbons, and other vanishing Asian species. Other new features include Wild Wonders Outdoor Theater and an environmentally friendly animal hospital. 2005 will see the opening of the Kids Zone, an interactive play area to engage the imagination of the youngest zoo visitors. Almost as a quiet testament to a century of change, the zoo's earliest structure, the long-abandoned 1899 Bear Pit, was demolished to make room for the new Wild Wonders Outdoor Theater, which showcases the zoo's dedication to conservation education.
The most attractive spot to be imagined, from the rugged splendor of the great cliffs at the shore and the deep silence and restfulness of the forest.
For many park visitors over the past century, it has been the forested areas of Point Defiance Park that have given the magnificent peninsula its meaning. Indeed, more than 100 years ago, the Park Board recognized that preserving a section of the peninsula's old-growth forest was a paramount mission. Writing in 1902, Park Board Secretary M.L. Clifford stated,
Many thousands of people from all parts of the United States visit this park and are there enabled to see the native timber of Puget Sound in its natural state. It becomes a matter of interest to all people of the United States to preserve, in some place, easy access to some tract of land covered with this natural growth.
The forests of Point Defiance, which still command the majority of the peninsula, have by design experienced less development than the rest of the park. Early vehicle traffic in Point Defiance Park was limited not only by the scarcity of automobiles, but also by the condition of the dirt roads. Recognizing this, in the summer of 1915, the Park Board implemented an early form of shuttle bus service. Visitors paid 10 cents per car passenger service that ran at regular intervals from the water tower, which stood near the lodge, around 5 Mile Drive and back. Some 5,000 visitors patronized this service in its first season. In that same year, the board also foresaw the coming car ownership trend and constructed the park's first auto parking ground, with a capacity of 250 cars near the main picnic ground. Located on the plateau above the beach, west of the original boathouse, has been a feature at Point Defiance Park from the early 1900s. Picnic shelters in the 1915 forest had concrete fireplaces with 3 by 6 foot stoves for cooking and stone chimneys. These structures were very similar to the WPA-era shelters that are still in use today. There was also a picnic area at the lookout point at the very tip of the Point Defiance Peninsula that gave visitors expansive views of the Narrows. Of course, at that time, the view would not have included the now familiar Narrows Bridge. In the Depression era of the 1930s, President Franklin D. Roosevelt instituted massive federal work relief programs to help put people back to work. Two of these programs, the Civilian Conservation Corps, known as the CCC, and the Works Progress Administration, or WPA, were responsible for much of the development in the park's forest. Thousands of man-hours were spent clearing and improving 5 Mile Drive and the various viewpoints along the way. They built the first road down to Owen Beach and several community kitchen picnic shelters, where countless gatherings have been held over the last 70 years. The CCC was composed of young men, 18 to 25, who often lived communally in camps. Camp Point Defiance was built in 1934 on a bluff below Fort Nisqually, which was in the process of restoration and reconstruction at the time. Camp Point Defiance operated for 2 short years, and little remains of the installation that originally boasted 15 wooden buildings, including a schoolhouse, hospital, officers' quarters, barracks, and latrines. From this base, some 200 CCC workers removed tangled and overgrown brush to reduce the fire hazard in the park. They improved miles of roads and paths and helped construct the covered community kitchen at Owen Beach. By the late 1930s, Camp Point Defiance had been given back to the public and was used for many years as Madrona Day Camp.
This fort is cool, Grandpa. I saw how they made butter 150 years ago with a churn. Is that how you made butter when you were a kid?
I'm not quite that old. But I do remember coming here myself as a kid and playing in the towers and pretending to fire the cannon.
Cannon? Cool!
Standing among the trees is Fort Nisqually, a recreation of the 1833 Hudson's Bay Company outpost. Originally located near the town of DuPont, the fort was the center of the Puget Sound fur trade until 1869. In 1933, the Tacoma Young Men's Business Club proposed to move and restore the last 2 surviving buildings of Fort Nisqually, the Granary and the Factor's House, to Point Defiance Park. Once the Granary and the Factor's House had been relocated and restored, the Fort Nisqually Restoration Project became a larger and more ambitious undertaking as funds and work crews were made available by the WPA. Assisted by the CCC, a number of additional structures were built to recreate Fort Nisqually as it appeared in the 1850s. By 1939, the 50th anniversary of Washington's statehood, various pioneer memorial organizations joined forces to mount a small display of artifacts in the Factor's House, which was the beginning of the museum collection and exhibits at Fort Nisqually. Through the decades, adults and children have explored the bastions and buildings and imagined themselves back in the days of trappers and explorers. The U.S. Congress has declared the Granary a National Historic Landmark, and the U.S. Department of the Interior named the Factor's House to the National Register of Historic Places. Over the last 2 decades, additional restorations have received national recognition and accolades. The history of the Hudson's Bay Company on Puget Sound is now brought to life for Point Defiance Park visitors through interaction with staff and volunteers in period clothing and historical reenactments. Another development in the forest, now just a memory, was the Point Defiance Riding Academy. From its beginnings in 1933 until its loss to fire in 1964, privately owned horses could be stabled on site, or academy horses rented to ride the more than 12 miles of bridle trails that crisscrossed Point Defiance Park. Today, these popular paths are used mainly by walkers and runners. Nestled off the road, just before Fort Nisqually, sits Never Never Land, which opened in 1964 as an enchanted world where fairy tales came to life to the delight of young and old alike. Humpty Dumpty, Little Boy Blue, Jack and Jill, and Old Mother Hubbard were some of the many characters depicted in cast fiberglass. Storybook scenes, characters, and nature coexisted in a magical way that transported park visitors from the everyday world. Just down the hill is the Camp 6 Logging Museum, offering park visitors another glimpse into Washington's heritage. Timber was the state's first major industry and created not just a living, but was also a way of life. Camp 6 opened in 1964 to portray a working logging camp circa 1900. It now depicts the entire era of steam logging, from 1880 to the mid-1940s, when loggers were boss and steam was king. In 1973, Camp 6 was listed on the National Register of Historic Places. Gardens have always been an important feature of the park, beginning with the Rose Garden in 1895 by Superintendent Roberts. Over the years, with the help of garden clubs and plant societies, multitudes of gloriously colored blossoms and lush greenery, viewed from meandering pathways and secluded benches, have drawn and inspired adults and children alike. The rhododendron garden, tucked away in the forest, contains more than 500 plants, including 198 different cultivated varieties and 75 species of rhododendrons. In the native garden, visitors can explore 7 vegetation zones of the Northwest on a hill above the bowl area. Adjoining the rose garden are the herb, fuchsia, dahlia, and iris gardens, offering 3 seasons of beautiful blooms and striking foliage. Today, Point Defiance Park continues to be a focal point for family and community life in Tacoma and throughout the region, beckoning visitors from near and far. With its major attractions, gardens, forests, and waterfront, there is truly something for everyone. Thousands gather for special events, while families and friends come together to celebrate their special occasions, or a casual picnic in the park. From the earliest days, astute, forward-thinking people recognized the value and importance of this park, and for more than 100 years, Tacoma citizens, park board commissioners, and staff have worked to protect our incredible heritage. 2005 is an important year for Point Defiance Park. As we celebrate its history and the memories it evokes within each of us, we also have the opportunity and duty as stewards of precious public green spaces to plan for its protection and future. All residents are invited and urged to join Metro Parks Tacoma in developing a comprehensive plan for the generations who will enjoy Point Defiance Park's next 100 years.
Boy, Grandpa, you sure have a lot of memories of Point Defiance Park.
I think anyone who's ever lived in Tacoma remembers visits to the park. It's been an important part of the area for a long time.
Can we come back tomorrow?
Of course we can. I think spending time here with you will turn out to be my most favorite memory of all.
Me too, Grandpa. Me too.